Hey, good afternoon, everybody. An educated economist here. So I came across this great article coming out of Reuters earlier today, dated December 16, 2018. 10 years on, the Fed's long, strange trip to zero redefines central banking, authored by Howard Schneider. And it says ZERP, ZLB, ELB, whatever the acronym, when the U.S. Federal Reserve dropped its policy rate to near zero on December 16, 2008 to counter a full-scale economic crisis, it ushered in what the central bank chairman at the time, Ben Bernanke, called the end of an old regime. A decade later, the full impact and import of that move are still not fully clear, but the Fed was never the same. The decision to move to zero ushered in wholesale changes to how the Fed works, from its building a massive balance sheet to adopting an explicit 2% inflation target and holding regular post-meeting press conferences. A new body of research continues to explore the likelihood that trips to the effective lower bound will be common. So this is a great article. It kind of carries on the conversation that we were having about the Fed policy speech and being stuck near this near zero interest rates. And it's almost as if the guy was part of our conversation on that. It goes on to say here, what is ZERP? It stands for Zero Interest Rate Policy and become one of the most common acronyms used to describe the 7-year period when the Fed's benchmark overnight lending rate was parked in a range of between 0 and 0.25%. Policymakers also called it zero lower bound and effective lower bound. The Fed was not the first to employ such an aggressive response to an economic downturn. The Bank of Japan adopted ZERP back in the 1990s in response to the collapse in a real estate market that helped trigger a decade of economic stagnation. So if you're not quite familiar with what happened there was a huge economic boom that happened in Japan, right? And the real estate market was it just went off the charts. And when it crashed, it was not a big enough demographic of people because basically you had this big baby boom generation, this booming generation. And when they started dying off, there wasn't a big enough generation coming in behind them to kind of make up for the loss of population that they were having. And they dropped the interest rates down to zero, and it created like this stagflationary period where they just could not get growth to happen at all. And it was like a 10 years of just nothingness, right? Why adopt ZERP? There was nowhere else to go. From July 2007 to the fall of 2008, the Fed had trimmed its target policy rate from 5.25% to 1%. The economy was so weak that many models indicated that the appropriate interest rate for the Fed would have been negative, in effect a tax on savings that might prompt people to spend. While theoretically possible and in fact later adopted by a few central banks elsewhere, negative interest rates would have been a political non-starter in the U.S. Congress and difficult to sell to the public in a fast-moving crisis. Instead, a dramatic Fed action drove the policy rate to a range of between 0 and 0.25%. It was, in effect, a zero rate, but more importantly demonstrated the Fed's willingness to go to extremes. Did it work? Not hardly. And the Fed officials knew the developing crisis needed more than just a standard interest rate policy, right? So they knew that even after they had dropped it from carry on here, after they had dropped it from 5.25% down to 1, they were like, oh no, this isn't enough. This isn't working. We can't get the economy rolling again, even though we have gotten interest rates down to 1. And a lot of them were like, well, we need to go negative because going to 0 isn't going to be enough. Did it work? Not hardly. And the Fed officials knew the developing crisis needed more than just a standard interest rate policy. I see a few advantages to gradualism. Then San Francisco Fed President Janet Yellen, the eventual chair, said according to transcripts of the December meeting, the statement announcing the cut also said the Fed will employ all available tools to promote the resumption of a sustainable economic growth. Right? That flagged what was to come, including trillions of dollars in asset purchases used to shore up financial markets and to maintain a long-term interest rate that are critical to the housing market and mortgage lending. Even though the Fed could not cut the target rate any further once the zero lower bound had been reached, the unconventional tools used by the Fed then still shape financial markets today. And those unconventional tools were the toxic assets that the Fed had bought up. So basically, all these banks out there were like, oh man, all these people, these foreclosures, things aren't going so well. We got all these assets and liabilities on our sheets here, and now the liabilities are far outweighing these assets because the assets aren't paying. What do we do, Fed? And the Fed was like, we're going to print up a bunch of money and buy them assets off of you and put them on our asset sheets. That's what we're going to do. We're going to buy the toxic assets off you. And that's what they're talking about, the tools, including trillions of dollars in asset purchases used to shore up financial markets and maintain the lower long-term interest rates. Right? So these financial markets are basically saying, if we got all these toxic assets, we're going to have to start demanding either a lot more down payment, a lot higher interest rates, whatever we need to do in order to start getting our assets back up. And the Fed says, if you do that, we're going to go further into recession. So we'll just get the toxic assets off your balance sheets, and we'll just have lower interest rates. So we're in the money again, right, guys? Go ahead and start lending out. Did it hurt? The unemployment rate is at the lowest in nearly 50 years. Inflation is hovering around the Fed's target. A near decade of economic growth will become the longest expansion on record next year. What's not to like? It took near 7 years for the Fed to leave the zero bound. The rates are still abnormally low. By some accounts, consumers and businesses may be addicted to the cheap money and so sensitive to interest rates that their willingness to buy homes and invest may fall more quickly than in the past as rates rise. Corporations, meanwhile, have gorged on cheap debt, possibly laying the groundwork for the next crisis. So what's not to like about the fact that they have done this? Taken interest rates down to zero and bought up all these toxic assets, right? Instead of letting them fail, instead of letting the banks fail and stuff like that. What happened is we got everybody addicted to this cheap debt. Right? Cheap money is so addictive to the people now that if you try and take it away, they start having panic attacks, right? And they're like, oh God, we can't do anything now if you take away our cheap debt. Right? Will it happen again? Almost certainly. The Fed has been raising interest rates now for 3 years, but does not expect to take them much higher than 3%. Target rate policy of 5% were the more common in the past, but few at the Fed expect return to those days. So most of the people at the Fed right now are saying that 5% interest rates are not in our future. We are not going that high. In fact, we're probably not going to even get over 3%. And now anybody who's watched my videos in the past know that that does not give us a whole lot of room to deal with during the next financial crisis. The working assumption is that rates globally will remain low than they were, and that policymakers will routinely reduce rates to zero in the future recessions. As consequences, they expect to keep tools like the asset purchases at the ready and are exploring other strategies, such as higher inflation targets that could lift all rates closer to their previous levels. The era of ZERP, in other words, may have just begun. So, yeah, in conclusion there, what he said at the very end, right, to explore other avenues such as higher inflation targets that could lift all rates closer to the previous levels, that right there is a very scary scenario, guys, because that is the point that where I believe that we would be heading into a very, very deep recession, if not depression era, right? Because we as a country and as a globe can no longer handle high interest rates. And it's not like, say, hey, we can go ahead and just take the hit as people and stuff like that and say we can, we'll suffer through it. We won't buy houses. We'll drive old cars and stuff like that. Who cannot handle it is the government. If we take interest rates from where they are today and we double them, there is no way that we are going to be able to maintain the debts and the deficits that we have. It would cause such a crisis that we're not talking like depression era. We are talking like super depression era, like super duper depression era, right? Because the amount of debt that has been produced and put out there and is now the heartbeat of America, right? It used to be off of productions and savings. Like we used to produce stuff and export it out through the world, and the world would send us their effort, right? And now all we do is borrow that effort from everybody, and it is due back to them, and we don't produce anything but more debt, right? That's the only thing we have to give. And in my opinion, when you have interest rates at 3% and you have no more room to work with, you're no longer a functioning company, right? You're done. And now the Fed has basically said that they are insolvent, right? By their toxic assets that they have put on their balance sheets, they no longer match the liabilities that they have out there. So what they had done is they had printed up all this money, bought up all these toxic assets, bought up all these bonds, they put them on their asset sheets, and they said, hey, it's okay because we have all these liabilities out there that match the amount of assets that we have. So if we ever need to take back our liabilities, which are all the dollars that they printed up, all they have to do is just basically buy them with or sell those assets back into the market, get those dollars back from it. Here's the problem. They bought up bonds in lots of them. And those bonds have an interest rate that is carried to them that is set, right? So as you start rising interest rates, the value of these bonds start to diminish because they have a lower interest rates to them. And a lot of people don't get that. As interest rates rise, bonds drop in price. As interest rates drop, the bond prices start to elevate. That's why buying bonds throughout the last 30 years has just been like a winning situation no matter what time you bought them, because interest rates have done nothing but go down the entire time. So if you bought a bond at any time in history, you could sell it for more than what you paid for it because it carried a higher interest rates than the bonds that are being sold today. Here's the problem. You put a bunch of bonds that have been sold in the last few years here, they don't have a very high interest to them. So as you start increasing interest rates, now you got bonds that don't have as much value to them. And who has a lot of these bonds? The Fed, right? And so these assets that they have are diminishing compared to the amount of liabilities that they have out there, all those dollars they printed up. Anyway, guys, I don't want to carry this too much deeper. We'll continue this conversation on just a little bit, right?